Well, hi everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Godcast with me, your host, Father Alex Frost. I am the Vicar of St Matthew's Church in Burnley and the host of the Godcast. I'm also the author of our Daily Bread from August to the Altar pre-story, which is available online and in all good bookshops. My guest this week on the Godcast is Professor Helen King, and Professor Helen has actually been on my podcast previously. We talked about matters of human sexuality and living in love and faith, but today we're going to be talking about her brand new book, which is called Immaculate Forms, Uncovering the History of Women's Bodies. So I do hope you enjoyed this interview. If you do, then please subscribe to my YouTube channel, or you can follow me on Twitter at AlexDJFrost. But for now, I very much hope you enjoy this interview with Professor Helen King. Well, I'm delighted to say that joining me on the Godcast today is Professor Helen King, and Helen is only the second person that's been a guest twice on the Godcast. That's how good she is, and I really hope we're going to have a fantastic discussion. Helen, how are you doing?
I'm doing okay, thank you. Thanks for that build-up. There's no way you could possibly live up to that.
I'm sure it's going to be great, but Helen, for people who don't know you or who might be discovering the Godcast for the first time, just give us a bit of a resume about yourself and about your work and where you're based and the kind of things that you specialize in.
Sure. So I'm a retiring academic. I'm sort of retired, but I'm not properly retired, because you never do when you're an academic. It's it's an identity. It's a bit like being a priest, I suspect. You just are. I worked at the Open University at the end of my career, and that was really good. I love the Open University. I love the whole sort of making education available to more and more people. I think that's my sort of mission in life, is to communicate knowledge to people and make them think. On the Church of England front, I'm an authorised lay preacher in the Diocese of Oxford, and I'm an elected member of Synod for Diocese of Oxford. So I've been on Synod for, feels like forever, doesn't it? But same length of time as you. We came on in, 2021? Was it? Yeah, gosh, it does feel.
Something like that.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, so I do that, and I do various sort of voluntary things like you do in my sort of retirement. So I help with the talking newspaper for the area. So I started off as a reader on that, and because I like reading things out loud. And then they ran out of people to do the technical stuff. Not very technical, just a bit, copying discs and things. So I became a copier. And this is sort of typical of me in the Church of England. It's like, I think that's what I'm called to. And then there's a gap, and someone goes, could you do that? And I think, all right then. And then you find you're sort of stuck in it. So that's why I'm a server, for example. I'm not good with sort of my hands. I sort of drop things, and I'm easily confused as to what to do next. I don't have a good body memory.
Yeah.
So as a server, I'm a bit of a liability, but I've got the hang of it now, I think. And that was just purely because they hadn't got anyone else. So yeah, it's what you do, isn't it? And I've recently had a book published, my first book for the general public, which is Immaculate Forms, and it's subtitled Uncovering the History of Women's Bodies. And it's everything I've always wanted to put together into a book for the general reader. Yeah,
and that's what we're here to talk about, isn't it? Unashamedly promote and push and sell your book. I was wondering, Helen, whether it was a tough sell to go to the publisher and say, I want to write a book about the woman's clitoris and vulvas and wombs and hymens. What was the kind of initial response when you said, I got this idea?
Well, it was actually very easy, because they came to me, which was amazing, because it's published by Profile Books in conjunction with Wellcome Collection. Wellcome is the big history of medicine funder in this country. It's got an excellent library, which I've used for many, many decades. And they came to me. They were looking for a book on the history of women's bodies. And they thought, oh, Helen King, she's done stuff with Wellcome. Let's ask her. So they came to me, and I said, oh, I don't know. Because I was still working full time, and it was a lot to think about. I was working full time. I was head of department in classics at the Open University. My mum was getting iller and needing more care. And I just thought, I can't take on a project this big. So I said, not yet. And then when I retired, I got back to them and said, maybe. And they went, yes. So it's been remarkably easy, actually, because the tricky bit is, how do you write a book on the history of the female body? I mean, you've mentioned the parts thing. So I've gone for 4 body parts. breast, clitoris, hymen, and womb. So going from the outside, what you sort of are aware of, to what you can't see at all until modern imaging methods. So that was how I did it. But my initial plan was to do lots more body parts. But then you think there's so much to say about each one. I mean, how long can a book be? This is already sort of 460 pages with pictures. Don't forget the pictures. And it's just impossible to think of a way of doing this. So it started off as a very different book. There were going to be chapters on voice and brain. And I thought, that's a lot of work to do. I don't really know a lot about the history of the brain and about women's and men's brains and whether they're supposed to be different or not. And I was quite interested to find out, but this, you can take forever, can't you, if you research everything? So I stuck with things I knew a little bit about, or that I thought I could find out about more easily.
There will be people out there who might be surprised that the Church of England vicar man is talking to a woman about women's body parts. But and I did get some extraordinary trolling when I was promoting this, Helen. Somebody
Amazing.
suggested I was being quite sordid. Also in my capacity as an inclusive church member promoting a campaign for same-sex relationships. Almost trying to portray me as some sort of weirdo and kind of freak. I was quite offended, really. But it's all right to talk about these things, isn't it?
It's all right. I mean, it's not talking about them that's the problem. Why do we have a culture in which we don't talk about bodies? Because you end up with things like people expecting that their bodies are abnormal because they've got no idea what normal might look like and what the range of normal is, People, body shaming obviously is a big thing in our culture. We need to know about the diversity of bodies, and we also need to know about the history of how they've been understood, because the sorts of things we say about bodies and we assume about bodies now are not always the same. And that's why history actually gives you the tools to think about bodies now and bodies in the future, and to make for a culture in which women are not seen as sort of weird and subject to strange bodily fluxes and fluids and that whole sort of anti-menstruation culture, where for years, you probably haven't been into ladies' toilets much, Alex, I'm guessing.
No,
no,
not
okay.
recently, no.
Oh, it's okay. So there used to be these extraordinary little paper bags you get in ladies' loos to put your tampons or your used sanitary towels in. And they had a woman in a crinoline, this enormous crinoline, carrying a sort of hat box. And I can think of nothing sort of less appropriate. If it just said, sanitary bag or something, even the word sanitary implies that women are not sanitary, that there's something wrong with menstruation. Even the term sanitary towels is a bit weird from that point of view.
Yeah.
But period products is quite a good term. It actually tells you what it is. And you get people occasionally on social media saying, I know my boyfriend is a keeper because when I got my period unexpectedly, he said, I'll go down the chemist and get you some tampons. What sort do you want? And you think that sort of normality about bodies, surely that's a more Christian approach to our created essence than going, ooh, mustn't talk about that. Ooh, no, boys, mustn't know. It's ridiculous.
Yeah. Well, we'll talk about a bit of the theology behind women's bodies in a second, Helen. But I was wondering, do we know much about the history of sex education? How far does it go back, kind of thing? I mean, I can remember being taught about these things in the 80s, and it looking back now, it seems utterly ridiculous. But can we trace it back to anything?
Yeah, even in the 19th century, there were some quite interesting books written by women for girls and young women to sort of tell them about how their bodies would be developing. And they'd often use really quite sort of euphemistic language. You wouldn't actually call things what they were. So you'd talk about flowers blooming and the bee sort of moving from flower to flower, taking the pollen across. And you think, the girl reading that, how's she ever going to expect sex to be if she's going to expect someone coming from flower to flower taking the pollen? Really, no. But some of those 19th century books, were very explicit. They named parts with the right names. They didn't pretend that there wasn't a clitoris, which some medical textbooks, even in the 20th century, were not labeling the clitoris, as in, don't want to talk about that, hasn't got a function, irrelevant, don't need to know. But you've got 19th century women writing books for girls in which they actually label it and say, this is a part that's associated with pleasure. You don't have to make it sort of dirty or weird. And interestingly, the women who wrote those books in the 19th century were often Christian women who were trying to sort of improve Christian marriage and to strengthen relationships between men and women by seeing knowledge as the answer, rather than girls going into marriage with no idea about anything. So it's interesting, Christian women have in fact been at the forefront of good sex education.
Yeah, and what do we know about kind of the liberalization of the human body? Maybe a shift from where all Christians just thought that sex before marriage was wrong. What period can we look to for changes?
For that, you need the extraordinarily wonderful Dermot McCulloch with his new book on sex and Christianity. So he's arguing that really throughout history, there have been different views on this. And it's only quite recently that it's all sort of coalesced into a very narrow view in which the only possible sex that's allowed is sex within marriage. In previous centuries, people were having sex outside marriage when they were already betrothed. That was kind of normal. And then you've got the whole question of what do you mean about sex? What is sex? Are we talking about penis in vagina? And we might as well say the words because otherwise we don't know what we're talking about. If you say sleeping together, I mean, come on, it's not really about the sleeping, is it?
It's not really, is it? And what about, also, I wanted to ask you about what we know about the history of contraception as well. When did that become a thing?
Contraception has been around in medical textbooks since the earliest period. So we're talking early Roman Empire. There's a doctor called Soranus who wrote a book called Gynecology, which talks about contraceptive methods. And they're quite connected to myth. So because the myth of the visit to the underworld by Persephone. So Persephone is carried off from the fields, and we would say raped, and why not, by the god Hades and taken to the underworld, and she eats the seeds of a pomegranate there. And depending on how many seeds she eats, that's how long winter lasts in the world above. So it's a really interesting myth about why seasons. But pomegranate seeds, because they're associated with that, pomegranates were used in early contraceptive methods, certainly from the 1st or 2nd century AD onwards. It wouldn't have worked, but that's not really the point. The point is people were trying. And some of the contraceptive methods in the early Roman Empire were things like magical things. So, wear an ivory bangle on your left ankle. But if you were doing that alongside some of the other things they recommended, like take a sponge, fill it with vinegar, insert in the vagina, now that would have an effect. So you could be doing multiple things together. And then when your neighbor says, gosh, you've gone 3 years without having another child, how are you managing that? You might just mention the ivory bangle on your left ankle, forgetting all the other things you're doing, and they think, oh, that's the answer. But there was a real quest for knowledge. People wanted to limit their families.
Yeah.
They wanted to have children, yes, but they also, at points, wanted to limit those families. So it's got a very, very long history.
And what about abortion? Where do we? I mean, I would guess much older.
Much the same. It's
much the same.
Yeah, even older, absolutely. So you've got people like this 2nd century AD gynecologist Soranus talking about how contraception is better than abortion. That's why you have contraception, it's to avoid abortion. Abortion is more dangerous. He fully accepts that. So let's find other methods. Of course, the fact that they probably wouldn't have worked is not helpful. But there's also even advice on how to avoid a miscarriage in the texts, medical texts from the 5th and 4th centuries BC, saying, don't carry heavy weights, don't jump up and down a lot, don't go upstairs, and so on, which suggests that they knew that. So if you wanted to repurpose that information, you could say, if you actually want to bring on an abortion, do all those things. So that sort of knowledge is there. And again, there are drugs, pennyroyal is a classic example, herbal drugs from the 5th century BC onwards that were being used to encourage a miscarriage, i.e. to have an abortion.
Yeah.
So there's a lot there. People always quote at you the Hippocratic Oath, which is a document not associated with Hippocrates, but we'll pass over that. It's another entire story. Hippocratic Oath says that you will not offer abortions. Only actually it doesn't. It says you will not give a woman a pessary to destroy the fetus, which might suggest that something you insert is seen as dangerous, which it probably is, because what you soak it in first and so on. Whereas other things like jumping up and down, which there's another Hippocratic text that talks about a girl who jumped up and down and fetus came out. I mean, it probably wasn't the fetus, but it's so complicated, you wouldn't believe it. But the point is that they are telling stories about someone who deliberately tries to acquire an abortion.
Yeah.
And they're sort of aware it's not a good idea health-wise, but they're not doing a blanket prohibition in the Hippocratic Oath. It's just a particular method that's seen as dangerous.
And were there penalties for misuse of this and things like that?
Nope.
No.
Nope. No one's going to know what you're doing. Questions there, of course, about how far anyone is doing things outside the sort of official medical practice. So you might not want to call in a doctor to help with something like this. You would be passing down knowledge from woman to woman of what to do. And I think that idea of a sort of woman's knowledge is very important in the history of medicine.
Yeah. And I'm not even starting my questions, Helen, but it is
yeah,
fascinating.
It's a good topic.
I mean, I just want to just perhaps bring this to a close. We're just asking about miscarrying then in those days, and how was that received by a community, or was this were we and trying to bring some theology in here? Was this occasionally seen as the work of the devil, or what was going on in those days?
Well, pre-Christianity, you've got the idea that the baby sort of needs to set in the womb before it's actually a baby. I mean, I think now we talk very freely about abortion as if from the moment that conception happens, that is a baby. Well, it's not a baby. It's potentially a baby, but it's not actually a baby. And earlier views would say that until the child moved in your womb, the term being quickening, until it quickened, that was not actually ensouled. The soul did not enter the body until the woman felt the child move in her womb. So early pregnancy, you can do what you like, really. It's not pregnancy. The seed hasn't fully set. It hasn't quickened. It hasn't got a soul in it. This is not a baby. So earlier views, and we are talking obviously into Christianity here. Christianity is taking over ideas about babies setting and how long it takes to set in the womb, and then adding in this concept of the soul to that. So yeah, early abortion or early miscarriage, not an issue. There was not a soul there.
And just returning to the book, Helen, how do you, I mean, talking about the human anatomy in one form, but actually bringing in the theology, how did you go about that? How did you think, right, okay, this explains the vagina or the clitoris or whatever.
Yep.
How do you bring theology into the book?
So I've got this theory that there are two ways in which women are told what their bodies should be like and what they should be doing with them, and that those two methods are through medicine and through religion. So the two of them work very closely together, I think. So for most of history, we haven't had this very specialist area of medicine and very specialist area of theology. It's all been much the same. So if you look at who did medicine in early modern Europe, sort of 16th, 17th, 18th century, often it would be the priest. The priest would have remedies and would use those on parishioners. The priest's wife, once priests were allowed to marry, would be doing the same sort of thing. So religion has always been connected to medicine. I mean, even in the Roman Catholic Church, a classic is that when someone is declared a saint, you have to have medical evidence. So you need to show that they have performed miracles. And how do you know if it's a miracle unless you know what normal medicine can do? The very earliest human dissections in Europe were done of people in convents, monasteries who died, who were considered saints, potentially saintly. So how do you prove someone's a saint? Well, one way, as well as collecting stories about them and looking for miracle stories, was to open their bodies up, because it was believed that their bodies would be marked in a special way. So there are some very early stories from late Middle Ages of opening up the body of a nun to find out if there's something a bit unusual in it that shows she was a saint. And if you can find, for example, on her liver 3 little bumps, you go, oh, it's the Trinity. Or you can open her heart and go, oh, look, that membrane looks just like a cross. Well, actually, if you cut pretty well anything in the shape of a cross, it looks like a cross. So it could be a bit of a fraudulent moment here. But the basic idea that your body is showing your religious status, whether you're saintly or not, I think is really fascinating. And even when dissection started to be performed for medical people, as opposed to for a religious audience, we're talking here 16th century, the people who did it were saying, actually, what we're doing with this dissection is we're showing the glory of God. Human beings are the peak of God's creation. So by looking into the body and seeing, oh, look, this goes here, this channel goes there, this makes this is actually showing God. So medicine was a way of showing theology.
It's fascinating stuff, isn't it? And then when we get into scripture, there is when I knew we were going to be talking about this, Helen, I was just kind of walking the dogs and thinking about, what do we see or recognize in scripture when we think about body parts? So first thing that came to you was the inordinate amount of stuff there is on circumcision, on the male, and then I was starting to think about the female, and obviously one of the key stories was that of the hemorrhaging woman. I wonder if you could maybe unpack why this analogy is used in scripture, and what was the key messages of the time, but also maybe that can be related to today as well.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, because the story of the hemorrhaging woman is something that's been used throughout history. I mean, it's represented in images, Christian art, as early as the 3rd century AD. But of course, you can't actually show that she's bleeding. How do you, that's a bit weird for these people. So you just show someone touching the hem of Jesus's robe, and the reader then, or the viewer then, understands that's the hemorrhaging woman. But then in Christian art, they start to think, well, actually, that's not enough. It could be the Magdalene, it could be Mary Magdalene coming to fall at Jesus's feet. It could be to wash his feet. It could be anything. So they then start adding an extra factor to the image, which is a spring. So you get a sort of fluids thing happening, spring, and then you get the woman touching the hem of Jesus's robe, and you make the connection. That must be the bleeding woman, which I think is a fascinating thing. So it's a really powerful story. It's one that Jane Manfredi has used in her recent book, Waking the Women, which is about the church and menopause now. And she makes the point, which is, it's not original to Jane, but she makes it really very powerfully, that the story of the hemorrhaging woman is set within the story of the daughter of Jairus. So the hemorrhaging woman has been bleeding for 12 years. The daughter of Jairus is 12 years old. It's like two women at the beginning and possibly the end of their sort of menstrual career. And Jesus is stopped on the way to deal with the daughter of Jairus by the hemorrhaging woman touching his robe. And then he turns around and says, "Who touched me?" And she comes and says, "It was me." And he says, "Go away, be healthy. It's all over now." And then he arrives at Jairus's daughter's house. And of course, she's already died. So she wouldn't have died if he hadn't been delayed. But then he raises her from the dead. So there's a sort of 12 years thing here. And certainly throughout the history of medicine, it's been expected that girls will start their periods pretty early. So usually the 13th year in ancient Greek medical texts. So, sorry, the 14th year. So they'll be age 13. So this girl, 12, she's on the verge of this. Of course, I have to say that this is theory. Obviously, a lot of women wouldn't match the ideal, and then they get all sorts of unpleasant medical treatments to make them match the ideal, but we won't go there. So Jairus's daughter is sort of like the young girl who's about to start her menstrual career, and that makes the bleeding woman, the hemorrhaging woman, sort of at the end of her career. Of course, we don't actually know where she was bleeding from, but the history of the way this has been interpreted in Christian history, in church history, has always been that it is from her vagina, that this is some sort of hemorrhaging from her vagina. And that would make her unclean. And in Jewish law, she'd be unclean. So for Jesus to allow her to touch him and to give permission, that's saying a powerful thing about women are actually not unclean as a result of their blood. So massive stuff going on there. And also things like Jairus's daughter, Jairus, rich man, the woman who's got the hemorrhages, she's lost all her money, she's spent it all on doctors, poor woman. There's all sorts of interesting bookending, connecting parallels going on there. Something very powerful. One of the first things I ever wrote a reflection on in a Christian context was when I was a research fellow at Newcastle. I was living in a college in Durham, Trevelyan College, And the chaplain there asked us to all do a reflection on a chosen Bible passage, whatever we wanted, to put into a little booklet for Lent. And I did the hemorrhaging woman. She just spoke to me as a woman who had endometriosis, who had all sorts of problems with bleeding. And wow, to find that I was welcome at Jesus's feet, that was really a moment for me, a very important moment in my own faith development.
Yeah, and it's a great metaphor for other people as well, isn't it?
Yeah.
And you also write. You said that you write about the womb, which obviously for me evokes thoughts towards the Virgin Mary, and forgive my ignorance, but is this the first example of this miracle? You know, in your historical experience, is there anything else that leads us in this direction at all?
There are certainly lots of classical myths in which people have anomalous births. So classic one is the goddess Hera giving birth to Dionysus after eating lettuce. And you think, lettuce? Last time I touch a salad again. But lettuce was an interesting drug in the ancient world. It was seen as aphrodisiac, so makes you sexy, and anti-aphrodisiac, so it kills desire. It was both, which is really hard for us to take on board. And the theory apparently is that because lettuce stems, when you break them, have a sort of milky fluid, that is somehow like semen. And that was how why the ancient Greeks thought of lettuces in connection with sexual stuff, which is interesting, certainly next time you eat a lettuce. So there were certainly stories of anomalous births. Jesus is in a tradition with that then. But then what do you do with Mary's womb? So is Jesus born normally? He's certainly not conceived normally. In Christian history, you have images of the Virgin Mary conceiving through her ear. So that sort of represents her hearing the word of God and saying yes to it. But it's also kind of odd, isn't it? You know, so the ear, there are representations of her receiving an egg containing Jesus into her mouth. You know, there's a lot of really unusual images here. It's like we're trying not to talk about the vagina because clearly she didn't have sex. That's the whole point. But so how did she conceive then? And then you've got the problem that in the history of medicine, Christianity has obviously shared these views because they were the views of the whole of society up till the modern period where medicine gets more specialized. So women's menstrual blood makes the baby. That's what they believed in most of the ancient world and into early modern Europe. So the blood somehow is the baby. The man, according to the philosopher Aristotle, the man impresses the form on the blood. So blood's like raw material, absolute mess. The man's seed brings it all together, makes the baby. But you need the blood. So if Jesus is conceived other than through sex, well, he's still made of Mary's blood, isn't he? And that gets tricky because it should make women's bodies really very valuable. You know, women's blood should be valuable. The blood makes the baby, for goodness sake. That's a version of conception that should make women special. But with Jesus, you've also got that, didn't go through the vagina thing. So was there any contribution from Mary's body? Because then also Mary is represented breastfeeding Jesus. And the view of the body that was held into the 18th century was that the blood that was your menstrual blood, once you'd given birth, it converted to milk, traveled up through channels to your breasts and came out again. Then you have people like Leonardo da Vinci illustrating channels which don't actually exist from the womb to the breasts. So breast milk is blood. That's the view through most of history. Breast milk is blood. So Jesus is being fed from something made from Mary's blood. So again, is that actually something which could value women more and could make their bodies seem holy rather than something unpleasant that we don't need to talk about?
And
I'm giving you vast amounts of history in a few moments.
it's absolutely brilliant. It really is. But do you think Christians have to explain the virgin birth, or is it enough to go, it's a mystery?
I'm with the it's a mystery, actually. I think the trouble with all of this trying to explain things is you're trying to explain something that's never going to be explained.
Yeah.
I mean, you can then start playing around with the words, so Greek Parthenos meaning virgin, but also meaning unmarried woman. So does it just mean she wasn't married? Then going back to the Hebrew words that sort of don't quite map onto the Greek words, where again, there's more things going on here than physical virginity. But then you've got the problem of Mary's hymen. Can we talk about Mary's hymen?
Go on, let's do the hymen.
Let's do the hymen. So the hymen idea, it's not actually a very old idea, bizarrely. The earliest texts that talk about bleeding at first intercourse, so the Hebrew texts, it's not at all clear that there's any idea of a membrane that breaks. It's that you bleed. Well, that could be because of pressure, rubbing, whatever. It doesn't mean there's actually a hymen, a membrane. The word only means membrane. It's a completely neutral word in ancient Greece. There's a god called Hymen in ancient Greece, the god of marriage. But the word hymen, it means joining. It's a membrane that joins two parts. So the idea is Hymen is the god of marriage because he joins the husband and the wife together into marriage. It's not about a membrane at all. So it's not membranes here. But the Virgin Mary, once you do get the idea of the hymen established, which is within the Christian era, and people expect that women have this membrane that must break in first intercourse, and that's sort of very vulnerable. So even when I grew up, you were told, you mustn't do horse riding unless it was, unless you were already sort of having your periods and things. You might break your hymen. Horse riding, bicycle riding in the 19th century, women shouldn't ride a bicycle in case their hymen broke. I mean, really, some women have a membrane, some women don't. Some of them are just disappear. You wouldn't know it was there. There's a thing called imperforate hymen where it doesn't break and it requires medical intervention. So does the Virgin Mary have a hymen became a genuine question throughout history. Because if she does have a hymen, surely it breaks when Jesus is born. How does he get past it? But then, in that case, is she still a virgin? Because if it's all about the hymen, is it about having sex with a man, or can anything else count as losing your virginity?
Yeah.
And Christians get around this by saying, in early church fathers sort of period, Roman times, by saying there's also spiritual virginity, and you can lose your physical virginity, but still spiritually be a virgin. And that is something which actually women today have sometimes found very powerful, because if, you lost your virginity, you had sex with someone ages ago and you really regretted it, and then, you wish you'd never done that, to be told actually that's your body isn't what matters is your mind. That's powerful. And women who come from cultures where honor killing is a thing and where their entire reputation can be ruined, there's a whole market even now in hymen reconstruction. This is how powerful this possibly non-existent part of the body has become.
Yeah.
And that's terrifying. People are spending money on this because they're so worried their bodies don't match this ideal.
It's so interesting. Just you talking there about Mary. I mean, I don't even know. I'm just a regular guy, but I can't physically prove that God called me to be ordained, for example.
No,
I just can't. But he did. I think I'm a person of integrity, honesty. I'm not making it up. I'm not doing it for the lifestyle, that's for sure.
No, nobody would.
Is there a correlation there in any way, do you think, or not?
That's interesting, isn't it? I mean, again, it's that thing that there isn't a physical proof, and yet that is your identity. So how do you physically prove you're a woman? Of course, this takes us on to debates like gender identity, trans identity, and so on. What is a woman? Do you have to have all these parts sort of in the right order to be a woman? Well, clearly breasts, you can have a very flat chest and you're still a woman, not an issue. Hymen probably doesn't even exist for most people, not an issue. Clitoris, well, the clitoris and the penis are remarkably similar. It's only recently that the clitoris has been found to have even more nerve endings than the penis and to extend even further than the penis. But they are very similar. And you can transform one into the other in surgery. Wombs, they're the tricky one. But do you need a womb to be a woman? And there are people with disorders of sex development who are assigned female at birth, it's a girl, and then find out only when they maybe find it difficult to get pregnant later in life, have tests and find they haven't got a womb. It happens. These things are not binary. I think that's one of my main points in the book, really. There's not a binary. Lots of people might fit one side or the other, but there are also people who don't. And it's not helpful to keep focusing on that binary.
Yeah, well, we're going down another route here, but I've
so many routes.
I'm an inclusive priest, which means that in my head I have to speak with people who I might not necessarily agree with. But I recently spoke to Helen Joyce, is it Helen, about the idea of non-identifiably women kind of using female changing facilities and things like that.
Yeah.
Where do you sit on things like that then, Helen?
I personally would much rather share a changing room with a trans woman than think that trans woman is going into the gents' changing rooms. I think it's safer for the trans woman to be in the ladies' changing room. So as far as I'm concerned, I'm fine on that. And I'm not remotely bothered about who's using the toilets, frankly. I mean, more and more we have gender neutral toilets where you can just go into a cubicle. That's surely the way to go.
Yeah.
I just don't really understand these panics, frankly. So yeah, that's where I am on that.
All right, we're going to finish in a minute, but it's been great. But something I did want to ask you about that is, to do with the women's anatomy is genital mutilation.
Sure.
And
yeah,
the how that kind of is still allowed to, in some countries, to exist, and maybe a little bit about the history of that, Helen, if you could just to explore that a little bit.
Sure. Well, so how do you put this really nicely? Operations on women's genitals to change them have been around for a very long time. So even in the Roman world, they talk about what they call an overlarge clitoris. Whether they're talking about the clitoris or whether they're talking about the labia is always quite hard to work out. But a woman who doesn't look right in some way, and surgery on them. But there's also a really scary trend. Trend is probably too strong. There's a thread, shall we say, running through history of the Christian church supporting operations on women's genitalia for medical reasons. Again, it's the church and medicine working together. So the classic story here is in the late 19th century. So not that long ago, actually, when a guy called Isaac Baker Brown decided that the cure for many women's diseases was to remove their clitorises. Now, we would say, oh, female genital mutilation. He was saying, oh, no, it's an important surgery. It's got a long history and it will cure hysteria, which we don't believe in now, and all sorts of other things. Just basically a woman who's behaving in a way that her husband finds offensive. She's talking too much. She's refusing to do what he tells her. The answer, take her clitoris off. And that was done in the 19th century with the support of the Church of England. The Church Times published an advert saying if any priest, hello, Father Alex, if any priest was having trouble with his women of his parish, he could recommend to their husbands that they should send them along to Isaac Baker Brown's surgical home in London, where they could have the operation. And the Archbishops of Canterbury and York were both patrons of the home. And the home had a chaplain. And that's what they did, was they removed clitorises. And after the surgery, they said that women were far, far better, very calm, very compliant. There's an example with a servant girl who was able to read her Bible after she'd had the operation. So I think as a church, we can't get too sniffy about female genital mutilation. We have a history of it in London in the 19th century and with the church's support. So there are lots of questions about FGM and about the different sorts of operation that are done and about which ones are more damaging than others. And it's certainly something where, there's a lot of different views. But I think as a church, we have to be aware that we have not been without blame in supporting this sorts of surgery. You've gone quiet, Father Alex.
Sorry,
probably had to there.
Yeah, gone
You went into shock.
Went into shock, but a sobering way to kind of bring the Godcast to a close. But your book is fascinating, and I think a lot of people will be interested too. So it's available where? Where can people get it, Helen?
Anywhere, usual places online, Amazon, Waterstone, Smiths, etc. But of course, I always recommend your local friendly bookshop because we need to support our bookshops. Immaculate Forms.
And people can follow you on Twitter or X as it's now called, can't they? If they want to discover more about your work. And yeah, fabulous. Well, Helen, thanks for your time. I hope it's been as interesting for you as it has for me. And I hope people have really enjoyed this. And if you have enjoyed this, do check out the Godcast, where there are numerous people from the world of religion and every other genre that you can think of as well. But Helen, for now, maybe we'll do another one. But for now, thanks for coming on the Godcast. Thank you.
Thanks very much. It's been a pleasure.